Hello there, welcome to the Saraway channel wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much, and I'm so delighted you've joined us for part 3 of our story tonight. And we do know that unfortunately Aunt Louise had a nasty accident when she took her dog for a walk in the woods, and as a consequence she was out cold and is currently in a coma at the hospital. And of course everything at home is falling apart, especially with her twin sister, who is the children's mother, because she can't bear the thought of functioning without her sister around. So let's continue with our story tonight, but before we do, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's continue with tonight's story. For some enigmatic reason, my parents falsely assumed that being vague about Aunt Louise and her precarious condition was the kindest thing to do for us. But I was not stupid, nor was my sister. We could feel the insufferable stranglehold of overwrought emotions in our household, so strongly, in fact, that it was almost impossible not to know that my mother was hanging on to a thread of hope. But every day that thread was getting progressively weaker and weaker, as if in any second it might just suddenly snap. My mother's morale sank to an all-time low. She became lethargically bleak. She was not eating very much. She lost a whole lot of weight, and there were sadly sunken hollows around her eyes. She had become almost skeletal, and although she was supposed to be supervising our lessons for us and teaching us in Aunt Louise's place, she did not commit herself to doing anything, as her mind was so fractured by her grief. She would leave us to our own devices, unbeknown to my father, who would have been appalled if he had known the lack of supervision and guidance we were receiving from her. It was like my mother was caught up in her own dreamy, illusory world, 100 million miles away from our current reality, as most of the time she seemed to be disconnected from us, preoccupied with her own thoughts, and barely functional in her daily life. Let's just say my mother, who once held the family together with a formidable cast-iron grip, seemed to be falling apart very easily, like a crumbling cookie, without Aunt Louise around. It was then that I realized how when you're a twin, without the other half, like my mother was to Aunt Louise, and with her no longer being around, she felt as if life had thrown her a curveball that she couldn't easily overcome. My mother said to me, "Donovan, help Gretchen with her schoolwork, won't you? I'm sure you can easily supervise your own study as well, can't you, love? I've got other things I need to attend to around the house." "Of course, ma'am," I had said, determined to be as helpful as I possibly could. I wanted to ease some of the pressure off my mother's back. I knew by the sorry sight of her she was not coping at all well, as Aunt Louise was one of the most important people in her life. I know that for my mother, being an identical twin had for her meant that she and Aunt Louise had practically been joined at the hip. Now it seemed Aunt Louise had been ripped away from our lives, and my mother was not faring well as a consequence. I would pray to God every single night to bring Aunt Louise home safe and well, but it felt as if my desperate prayers had fallen on deaf ears, almost as if God himself was not listening to me. Every time my mother returned from hospital after visiting Aunt Louise, she visibly became more and more subdued and forlorn, as if her hopes were being squeezed out like the remaining juice in a lemon until there is nothing left to give. When she did acknowledge us, she'd snap at us and get extremely angry about the smallest things that would set her off like an alarm clock that you couldn't shut up. Suddenly everything little and insignificant that would normally not have been a big deal for her had become like the end of the world, especially like when I dropped some boiled egg on my shirt one morning. You would have thought I had committed a grave felony, or that World War III had just started. "Why are you so messy, Donovan?" she practically screamed at me. "Look at the boiled egg. It's supposed to be in your mouth, not all over your crisp white shirt," my mother said, rolling her eyes at me in exasperation. "Honestly," she said, shaking her head objectionably, "I despair with you kids. Sometimes I really do." "I'm really sorry, Mum. The egg just dropped off my spoon," I explained, trying to tell her it wasn't my fault, just a sleight of hand, but there was no reasoning with her. You dropped some boiled egg just randomly off your spoon, is that what you're trying to tell me? To anoint your crisp white shirt with yolk? Honestly, that wouldn't have happened, Donovan, if you'd paid attention when you were eating your breakfast. Is that too much to ask? My mother then picked up a piece of cutlery off the breakfast nook and furiously flung it at the wall to let off steam, and then stormed out of the kitchen, leaving me and my sister close to tears. We couldn't understand why our mother was being so awfully mean-spirited towards us and so incredibly unreasonable. But our father assured us that hurting people tend to hurt people, and that we mustn't take our mother's outbursts too personally. "Give her time, kids," he told us. "You must remember, this is your mother's sister Louise we're talking about. It's difficult for folk like us to fully understand the bond between identical twins. But with your Aunt Louise in such a bad way, and still in a coma, in hospital, well, your mother isn't handling things very well, is she? Don't be too hard on her. Give her some time. Help her around the house as much as you possibly can, to make life a little easier for her. I'm sure she will appreciate your efforts. She's going through her personal dark night of the soul, so to speak. So none of this is easy for her." "But, Daddy, she's always angry. She barely acknowledges us anymore," I complained. "Look, kids, your mother's grieving. She's worried about your Aunt Louise." "But Aunt Louise is going to get better, isn't she, Daddy?" my sister interjected. "Mummy said she would get better. She promised she would." My father grew very solemn, almost as if a dark cloud had suddenly crossed over his face. His voice lowered. "Don't tell your mother I told you this, will you? But to be perfectly honest with you, the doctors aren't holding out much hope for your Aunt Louise. It's not looking very good at the moment. I don't think they believe she will recover, but your mother refuses to give up on your aunt. So this is a very delicate time for her. I'm only telling you this not to upset you, but to help you understand why your mother is in such a dreadful state of late." "But the doctors are wrong, aren't they, Daddy?" my sister persisted. She was like a dog with a bone, determined to hear my Aunt Louise would be all right from my father. "But of course they're wrong, Bug," my father said affectionately, running his hand through my sister's curly blonde hair, looking for a second as if he almost regretted telling us the sobering truth about Aunt Louise's flailing condition. But my sister didn't seem to be taking on board the gravity of everything, as at 8 years old she had such a positive, optimistic outlook on everything, and in her illusory world where fairies and angels roamed supreme, she doggedly entertained her imagination with only happy endings to every story that was ever told. "Well, Mummy's just being silly," she insisted. "Aunt Louise is going to get so much better. She's going to come home very soon, and everything is going to be just fine," my sister piped. "That's right, Donovan, isn't it?" she said, her keen blue eyes fixed pleadingly on me, willing me to say anything else other than to agree with her that Aunt Louise's story would ultimately have a happy ending. "Of course she's going to get better," I said, in a voice that clandestinely hid all my doubt. To all intents and purposes, during this tumultuous, rather troubling time, our father was our only anchor for holding things together, because quite frankly my mother had lost it, and was now seemingly living in an alternative, rather hollow reality, in which we did not seem to exist. On numerous occasions my father had very diplomatically told my mother to visit Dr. Thornby, our family GP in Anchorage, but my mother was having none of it. Her burgeoning depression appeared to have ingrained itself into the pores of our cabin, rather like a rancid cancer that was getting progressively worse every single day, and it had almost certainly drained the joy away from our home, as clouds of hopeless, clawing, almost defeated darkness seemed to hang over our lives, like an oppressive curtain. My parents began to engage in tireless arguments together, and before Aunt Louise's fortuitous accident, they had never argued a day in their lives. They were stingingly at each other's throats, day in and day out. I think my father was glad to escape to the confines of his office, just to get away from my mother's insolent rhetoric. She was so unpleasant to be around. Each day she got more and more cantankerously pugnacious, and there were times I thought my mother fit the profile of quite literally being the world's worst mother, but I kept such thoughts to myself. following my father's methods of successfully escaping my mother. Likewise, me and my sister Gretchen would shrink away to the living room, where we would embroil ourselves in our studies. We would do everything in our power to avoid our mother, or any contact with her. My mother had successfully withdrawn from basic household duties, such as preparing our meals for us. Me and my sister Gretchen became incredibly hungry, with young healthy appetites that needed feeding, so we became industriously resourceful. I'm proud to say at 10 years old, I learned to cook by reading my mother's recipe books, and so I was the one that began to organise the family meals and take charge of things around the kitchen. Me and my sister Gretchen had learnt to fend for ourselves, as our sense of survival seemed to kick in. My mother was increasingly spending more time in her bedroom, sleeping for hours at a time, and we began to barely see her at all. I think sleeping away her melancholia had become rather like a coping mechanism for her. She barely went to see Aunt Louise again, because seeing Aunt Louise in such a precarious condition upset her all the more. "Look, love," my father said to my mother, trying to be as tactful as he possibly could. "I know you're upset about Louise, but we can't go on like this as a family, can we? You're very much upsetting the kids. Even Pipkin is a little down in the dumps these days. Everyone's picking up on your downcast energy, and it's not healthy. You really need to get your act together. Everything in this cabin is falling apart, and you are at the helm of the ship, and now you're not, so everything is crumbling. Donovan is doing all the cooking of the meals, and Gretchen helping with some of the household chores. It's asking a lot for our kids to be playing the role of caregivers in our household. They're very young. They should be out there enjoying themselves. You've always been such a good mother, but now you don't seem to care about anything anymore. You're always distracted these days." "Oh, so this is my fault, is it? Is that what you're saying? That's rich. I've been going through hell, I'll have you know. Can't you possibly understand that? Do you know what it's like seeing my sister Louise lying in a hospital bed in coma, never knowing if she's ever going to wake up? Do you have any comprehension of what I'm going through? Do you?" "I understand that, love. I know how close you are to your sister Louise. But you're not coping, are you? Anybody can see that from a mile off." "Of course I'm not coping. Talk about stating the blindingly obvious. Louise is my identical twin. Without her, I'm absolutely nothing. Can you appreciate that at the very least?" "Don't be ridiculous, love. You're a person in your own right. You're an individual. And although you're physically identical to your sister, she does not define you, nor do you define her. I just think—" "Oh, what do you think? Spit it out, then," said my mother, glaring at my father contemptuously with killer looks, and straddling her arms on her hips in a defensive gesture. "I think you need to see Dr. Thornby. He's an excellent GP, with a very good listening ear, I'm told. It's obvious you've sunk into a deep depression. I think if he were to prescribe you some anti-anxiety medications, it would help a great deal, so that it would take some of the sting out of your pain, so that you could manage your life a lot better. You know it makes a lot of sense. Everyone needs a little help from time to time, and they shouldn't feel ashamed to ask for it." "Medication?" my mother snorted. "I don't need medication. Are you trying to say I'm mentally deranged or off my rocker? Is that it? I'll have you know my sister Louise is in hospital, and she might not wake up from her coma. I think I'm entitled to be upset, don't you? It doesn't mean I need medication." "Of course you're entitled to be upset. We are all very upset about Aunt Louise. But this is more than about being upset. You're falling apart, love. I can't simply sit back to watch you physically decline like this. I'm your husband. I have a duty of responsibility to take care of you, do I not? What kind of a husband would I be if I didn't get you help?" My mother gave my father a look of scathing disgust. "So dragging me along to see Dr. Thornby for some medications is your answer, is it?" "I think you need to see him, love, as soon as you possibly can. You're not coping with your life. You need help. Lots of people take anti-anxiety medication when they're going through a struggle. So should you." "How dare you tell me what I need to do?" said my mother, growling. She stormed off to her bedroom, slamming the door behind her so loudly that the entire cabin began to wobble and shake. under the ominous vibration. My father looked at us and sighed in exasperation. He was totally spent trying to reason with my mother, who was mulishly stubborn at the best of times, even though she was a lot less so than her sister Louise. But without Aunt Louise around, my mother's stubbornness seemed to have stretched over the boundaries of even being reasonable. My father ran his hand through his dark black hair, and that was when I noticed the bags under his eyes, and how broken up he looked. I realized that my mother, her moods, her temper tantrums, and obvious depression were sucking the life out of the all of us. But my father was not faring well either. I guess he was beginning to wonder if he was losing his wife. "Don't be sad, Daddy," said my sister Gretchen, instinctively running towards my father and wrapping her small arms around him and refusing to let go. "I know Mummy is very sad at the moment, but if Aunt Louise would wake up, then everything would be all right, wouldn't it? Why can't somebody tell Aunt Louise to wake up? It's very, very mean for her to keep sleeping when everybody wants her to wake up, and she can't be tired anymore. She's been asleep for a very, very long time. She's upset everyone, hasn't she?" "You're right, Bug," said my father. "If Aunt Louise would wake up, everything would be all right." "Somebody needs to tell Aunt Louise to stop being so lazy and sleeping for so long. She needs to wake up now. I get into trouble if I oversleep during the weekdays, but nobody gets angry with Aunt Louise when she's so naughty because she never stops sleeping anymore." "It's not as simple as that, Bug," my father said, "but I sure do wish it was." I was having sleepless nights, worrying about Aunt Louise, and whether she'd ever return home or not. Pipkin was visibly distressed, with her not being around about. The dog had tuned into the negative energy in our home, as no one had laughed in our cabin for ages. The fun-loving home I'd always known and loved so much had lost its lustre. Even though I was helping with the cooking, I was not particularly good at cleaning up after myself. The place was a bit of a pigsty, a disagreeable mess, with dirty dishes accumulating in the sinks and clothes strewn haphazardly all over the place in puddles, while dust collected on the furniture. It was my father who began to run our house for us, as well as spending his time focused on his full-time job, because my mother seemed incapable and incompetent of doing anything, and appeared to have gone into hibernation, rather like a bear. Me and my sister were much happier when my mother locked herself away in her bedroom for hours on end. I found myself praying that she wouldn't come out of her bedroom, as just seeing her made me feel miserable. The house was much more calm without her presence around. Pipkin began to follow me everywhere I went, as if I had now become his newly adopted best friend. The cabin felt so dreadfully soulless without Aunt Louise around, and this was a time in our lives that I rarely felt as if happiness had eluded us. After a while my mother did begin to make an appearance, around the house that is, but she looked absolutely dreadful, like a mad washerwoman who'd put her hair through a vat of oil, as it hung around her face in greasy strings. She never bothered about what she wore, and appeared to wear the same sweatpants every single day. She would scramble around in the wine cellar and bring out a bottle of wine, and very often she would start drinking in the middle of the day, and I knew that this was not good. "What the hell is wrong with you, woman?" my father said to my mother, when he realized she was using drink as a tool to drown her sorrows. It was one thing my mother locking herself away in her bedroom for days at a time, but turning to alcohol was not a solution that would solve any problems in a hurry. "Get a grip, will you? You can't start drinking to drown your sorrows. This is ridiculous. You have kids to look after. You're a mother. You're leaving them to fend for themselves, make their own meals, wash their own clothes, because you don't do a damn thing around here. You're bone idle and incredibly selfish. That's what you are. What kind of a mother does that? You should be ashamed of yourself." My mother whined. "You don't understand. I need the alcohol. It calms down my nerves. It makes me feel somewhat better." My father grabbed the bottle of wine from my mother. He was outraged. He looked more livid than I'd ever seen him look before. "You don't need this. It will destroy you. Alcohol is not your friend, and it isn't a solution." He had thrown the bottle of red wine into the sink, where it crashed into a million pieces, and all the wine drained away, leaving what looked like a residue of bloodstains behind on the white sink. My mother charged over to my father indignantly. Her dark-rimmed eyes were gouging with rage. It looked as if they were on fire. She began to pummel his chest with her fists. "I needed that alcohol! How dare you waste perfectly good, very expensive wine like that and toss it away? I needed that to calm my nerves." "You didn't need alcohol, Angela. What you need is to get a grip. Yes, I know how tough this has been for you, with your sister being in coma. But you have to hold it together for the kids' sake and for me as well. We need you to be around for us. And if you turn to alcohol, we will lose you. There are people all over Alaska, as you well know, dependent on alcohol and drugs. We've got a problem in this place. I don't want your sorry story to be added to those stats. You need to be strong, love. I wish you would go and see Dr. Thornby. I really do. You need help, and drinking wine is not the solution to your problem. It'll make things 1,000 times worse." My mother burst into tears. "Louise is going to die," she cried out. "I know she is. She might never wake up, and I'll be on my own for the rest of my life." "What are you talking about, Angela? You've got me and the kids, have you not? If the worst were to happen, you would not be alone. We are here for you. You need to be strong. Besides, there are people who have been in coma that have woken up even after years of being out cold. You don't need to lose hope, not yet anyway. The doctors still say there's a slim chance she might wake up, don't they?" "Oh, you believe them, do you? Slim chance? What does that mean? I can read between the lines. I'm very savvy like that. I don't believe they hold out much hope for her. What if they insist we switch off the machine that is keeping her alive? Then we lose her for good, don't we? What if they say she's become a vegetable and there's no more activity left in her brain? What then?" "We will cross that bridge when we come to it, Angela. But medicating yourself with alcohol is not the answer. Do you understand? This is not a solution, and I'm sorry, but I can't have my kids watching their mother turn to drink." My mother nodded. She blew her nose into her tissue and wiped her tears away. "You're right, of course. I will admit that," she said, straightening up rather stiffly. "I need to get a grip," she told herself more than us. "I won't drink any more, I promise." "Good. That's what I hoped you would say, Angela. I'm proud of you," said my father, walking away and returning to his study. I knew when my father's back was turned, my mother would go straight back into the wine cellar and grab for herself another bottle of wine to soothe away her angst, for nothing would stop her, as her determination was fierce. Once my father had left the kitchen, my mother turned around to look directly at us. I think the only thing on her mind was to get rid of us. She could clandestinely then go to the wine cellar and retrieve for herself another bottle of wine. "Go, will you?" said my mother. "Why don't you both go and play outdoors? It's a lovely, lovely day today, and I think you should make the most of it." "But what about our studies?" I asked. "Oh, don't worry about those. Everybody deserves some time off, don't they? Why don't you go and have some fun for a change?" Me and my sister didn't need any further prompting. This was an opportunity when we didn't have to study, but enjoy ourselves instead. So we hurried out of doors, happy to be away from my mother, on this beautiful, inviting spring morning, where an ethereal burst of sunshine lit up the entire landscape in a resplendent, soft, warm glow. The spectacularly beautiful scenic views that stretched out before us were like a warm, all-embracing hug, which did much to ease the stormy trepidation in my own heart. I was genuinely glad to be out of doors. It was medicine for the soul, especially after the cold, brutal winter that we had just endured. I hungrily lapped up the sunshine, and the feel-good factors that come from spending time out of doors immediately uplifted my spirits and seemed to have a positive uplifting effect on me, as this injection of sunshine was exactly what the doctor ordered. Pipkin was the most delighted of the three of us to be running around in circles, barking jubilantly. His tail thrashed around, and his enthusiasm to be outside was infectious. He made both me and my sister laugh. I think it was the first time in ages I can honestly say we'd actually smiled. Before long, me and my sister were ambling down the zigzag of footpaths through the trees. We were steadily making our way towards the undulating hilly meadow, covered in vast, exquisite stretches of fragrant alpine flowers. It was here where we would find the large oak tree, which stood up proud and tall, seemingly stretching out its gargantuan branches to the heavens, rather like a monk deep in prayer. This was a tree we loved to climb. Me and my sister had even carved our names and dates of birth into the robust, very sizable trunk. It was here we'd often sit in that tree, in the branches, for hours on end, just living in the moment, and watching the world industriously go by, like birds in the heavens flying from one tree to another, or a deer darting through the trees, a squirrel racing up a tree trunk, and so much more, of course. As we walked through the trees, we sashayed past the creek of fast-moving water. I loved that creek so much. It was making such a loud, gurgling, thunderous noise. We could hardly hear ourselves think. We often frequented that creek during the summer months, with our fishing nets at hand, where we would paddle in the water with our pants rolled up to the knees, trying our level best to catch fish that seemed to fly past us at the speed of light. We'd sometimes caught a few stragglers if we'd been very lucky, and the occasional frog, but we'd always put back what we'd caught into the water. Today we had no intention, of course, of playing around the creek, although I will admit I was sorely tempted to do so. But today me and my sister Gretchen had promptly decided we wanted to hang out around in the reassuring, comforting branches of the old oak tree that had become like a good friend to us. My father told us once that this old oak tree was between 400 to 500 years old. I often wondered if the great enduring age of the tree was why we liked it so desperately much, for we always gravitated towards it when we needed to lift our flagging spirits. I think the tree, having been grounded to the earth for so long, was like a wise old soul to us, giving us a sense of perfect security that sadly at the time was lacking in our daily lives. Put it this way, we had almost certainly been caught under the stronghold of my mother's lugubrious melancholia that hovered around the cabin like an unfortunate smell. So gravitating to the beauty of the natural world was healing and cathartic, and made us feel both safe and secure. I knew we both would feel much better escaping the gloominess of the cabin to spend some quality time outdoors. Even the inviting fresh crisp air and the warm sunshine seemed to put a band-aid on our current sense of hopelessness that we all felt. We finally reached the alpine meadows, bespeckled with magnificent beautiful carpets of pretty yellow, white, pink and purple flowers, the first eruptions of spring's glory, that had thrust their jewels through the earth with an unwavering tenacity, and cast their beguiling charms over the meadows in a splash of joyous colour, which they did year after year during the spring to summer months without fail. "It's so beautiful out here," my sister cried out with glee, her words echoing my very thoughts. I watched Gretchen skipping through the meadow. She picked up some flowers which she put in her hair. "Do I look like a princess, Donovan?" she asked me, doing a double twirl so that I could take a long, hard look at her. "You sure do," I told her. My sister's face was glowing. She looked radiant, and for a brief moment we forgot about the silent pandemonium that had disrupted our lives. We forgot about my father studiously working in his office. We forgot about Aunt Louise lying in a hospital bed, fast asleep, with the nurses and doctors monitoring her every need. We even forgot about my mother, who was in no doubt waiting for the perfect opportunity to steal away another bottle of wine from the cellar, when nobody was looking. Right now it was us against the entire world, and I felt so elated being out here, among so much beauty, that for a while my troubles seemed so far away, seemingly beyond my reach, like a kite that had blown away in the sky. "Race you to the oak tree!" my sister cried out. "I bet I can beat you, Donovan!" "No, you can't," I said competitively, leapfrogging ahead of my sister and reaching the tree steps ahead of her, but feeling slightly out of breath, as my sister could run like the wind. But I was not going to live it down if she ever beat me. "You might be a bit faster than me," she said, "but I'm still a better climber." Of that I could not dispute, as I watched my sister ease her way nimbly up the branches, as if she'd been a monkey that lived in the trees all her life. She made climbing a tree look beautiful and elegant, like when you're watching gymnastics and the athletes do these incredible twists and turns. They make it look easy until you attempt to try and do the very same thing yourself. I'm afraid I was not nearly as agile as my sister, so my attempts to climb the tree were done with more of a heavy hand. The old oak tree was designed for climbing, and me and my sister wasted no time in climbing into the branches. The first sprouts of spring leaves were visibly on display. Pipkin stared up at us, scratching the bark of the trunk with a paw, looking at us through his soulful dark eyes, as if he didn't feel entirely comfortable with us looking down on him from such a vast height. "I think he's sad because he can't climb," my sister chuckled. Pipkin lay down under the tree, stretching out his paws lackadaisically, while we sat in the branches staring at the scenery for miles around, and watching bees and butterflies pollinating all the flowers. All of a sudden, Pipkin sat up erect. His ears were pinned forward. His blonde tail thrashed the ground excitedly, and then he suddenly took off through the alpine field like a bullet. "What's that all about?" asked my sister. "I don't know," I said. "He seems happy about something, doesn't he?" "He sure does," Gretchen agreed. "That's how he reacts when Aunt Louise comes back from Anchorage. Well, when she was well, that is." So there we are. That's the end of part 3 of our story. Part 4 is tomorrow night, and I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.